The governor gave his second State of the State address earlier this afternoon, and he called for compromise.
If we work together, Illinois can be both compassionate and competitive.
Well, we'll have Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan to give us the Democratic response to the speech, and Senator Christine Radogno will join us to speak for the governor and Illinois Republicans. All that more live tonight on Capitol Connection.
From the Illinois State Capitol, this is your Capitol Connection.
Well, good evening. Again, welcome to a live edition of Capitol Connection. Governor Bruce Rauner outlined his plans for 2016, and we'll have reaction from both sides. But first, we'll start with our own reporter, WCIA's Kelsey Gibbs. Kelsey, you watched the State of the State. Help us break it down for us.
Well, Matt, in that 35-minute speech, we specifically heard from the governor mention a little bit about the budget crisis, but that was not until the very end, which came at no surprise to many people that we caught up with today. Now, Rauner spent most of the speech reiterating his structural reforms. He said unwillingness to pass the turnaround agenda reforms continue to stifle the economic growth and drive people and jobs out of the state. Rauner again called for changes to Illinois workers' compensation policies. He continued to push reforms that would limit union bargaining across the state.
We must break from the politics of the past and do what is right for the long-term future of the state. I'm ready. And it's my genuine hope that you are too.
Examples where the sides were able to come together this past year, including agreements on criminal justice reforms and streamlining some agencies. Now, Rauner did hit on some bipartisanship with the Senate president and their efforts on pension and education reform.
Well, thanks, Kelsey. Thanks for that report. And, of course, the governor spoke about several new plans in his 2016 State of the State. The governor called for a 10-point plan when it came to education to get people from cradle to career. And the governor also endorsed Senate President Culligan's pension reform plan that could save the state an estimated $1 billion a year. And he asked lawmakers to pass criminal justice reforms that could reduce the prison population by 25% in the next 10 years. Now, the governor has spent most of 2015 blaming Democrats for the lack of the budget, particularly House Speaker Michael Madigan. We'll have him joining us in a few moments to talk about his response to the State of the State today and how the prospects for taking the governor's second year in office. Next.
Diepholz Auto Group is proud to sponsor this portion of WCIA 3 News.
If you want more car for your money, say yes to a Ford at Ford City. You'll say yes to a huge selection and low prices. You'll say yes to a 26...
Well, Governor Rauner's speech was supposedly meant to be an olive branch, according to Republicans, but many Democrats felt different. Here to give us the Democratic response to the speech is House Speaker Michael Madigan. Speaker Madigan, thanks for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Nice to be with you.
A lot of Democrats tell me that they were surprised not to hear a lot about the budget in this speech. Do you feel the governor left out the biggest elephant in the room?
Well, I found the speech to be very interesting, especially the aspects of the speech where the governor was claiming accomplishments, where accomplishments had been achieved through compromise. So as an example, the governor talked in terms of the level of appropriation for elementary and secondary education, setting a record. In addition, he talked in terms of the correction to the earlier budget, which he called upon when he first came in as governor. He also talked in terms of landmark public safety legislation, which basically meant that there were reforms for police officers such as body cameras. And then he talked in terms of unemployment insurance. My reaction was, you're right, Governor, these were accomplishments where everybody worked together, but they were instances where the governor did not lay down his demand to implement his program, which would bring down wages and standard of living for middle-class families and send indigent workers to the welfare and to the
and
emergency
you've mentioned
room.
that at length, that the governor has not been reasonable, and if the people were acting reasonably, a budget deal could be done. Well, you've met with the governor now two times. There were 3 meetings, one you missed. Tell me, have those gone any better? Are you getting any closer to the budget, to a reasonable agreement?
The meetings are always very cordial. There's a free exchange of ideas, but The governor consistently talks in terms of his program, which, in our judgment, would lower wages and the standard of living for middle-class families.
What about the governor? You know, he said that you're not being much of a participant in these meetings, saying that it's you that's holding up this process.
Well, it's understandable that the governor would look for someone to blame and try to exclude himself from blame. My position has been clear from the very beginning. The #1 problem facing the government of the state of Illinois is the budget deficit and the general debt situation. And that's what we ought to focus on.
You know, the governor mentioned his turnaround agenda a lot in this speech. Did it sound like the same governor you've been dealing with, or does it seem from this speech that there might be a budget deal coming soon? Did you hear anything different from the governor to this speech?
I would feel better tonight had the governor spent more time talking about budget making during his speech. It was mentioned, but clearly he could have devoted more time to the budget making, which is why we should be here and what we should be doing.
And why do you think the governor avoided talking about the budget, which has been the biggest story since July?
Well, because the governor is in the second half of he's beyond his first year. He's into the beginning of his second year in office, and he hasn't adopted his first budget. It's understandable he wouldn't want to talk about that failure.
Well, the governor has told me that if the Democrats want to balance the budget, they have the supermajority, and they could pass tax revenue. What's your response to that idea?
That's not a realistic position. Democrats are not going to pass tax increases on their own. I've acknowledged from the beginning of last year, the beginning of the budget making, that Illinois does not have the money to pay for the budget that the legislature sent to the governor in May. I've acknowledged that publicly, but I've stated I'm prepared to negotiate with the governor to find the revenue to pay for this budget. And in my view, what we need is a balanced approach. Some cuts, like Senate Bill 788, which would have reduced Medicaid spending by $400 million. But at the same time, when we talk about new revenue, I think we ought to impose taxes on the wealthy.
Yeah, the governor says he's compromised, and you haven't reached out. What are some of the parts of the turnaround agenda that the governor's talked about that you'd be willing to accept, vote for? What could you vote for?
Well, let's start with workers' compensation, which is one of the governor's favorite topics. The House has passed a bill that would change the workers' compensation system. We acknowledge there are changes that could be done, that should be done. And in the House bill, we provide that there would be rate regulation on the insurance companies that sell workers' compensation in Illinois. That would be a good, solid step to bring down the cost for employers buying workers' compensation insurance.
Is this idea of local control, you know, there's been a property tax bill that's been passed, you said 17 times. The governor wants that local control aspect that could reduce union bargaining. Is that dead? Is that dead on arrival?
Well, what the governor is really saying there is that he wants to change collective bargaining. This is part of his anti-union agenda. This is part of the governor. The governor is anti-union. And what he wants to do is to change collective bargaining to reduce the influence of unions in collective bargaining.
You said that you don't have a supermajority in the House, and that's partly because Representative Ken Duncan has voted against you in a number of times this year. Is Ken Duncan a Democrat in name only at this point?
I think we should clarify. Ken Duncan didn't vote against me. He voted against the voters in his district that sent him to the legislature to represent poor people and those that need programs.
Do you think he's still a Democrat
well,
at this point?
That'd be a good question for you to put to Ken Duncan.
Would you consider letting out of your caucus if you were so willing to leave?
Well, that would be his decision. If he wished to leave us, why, he could leave us and there would be nothing we could do about it.
We're running out of time, but I've got to ask you, what's your estimate of when we might see a budget deal voted on?
Yeah, we should have had this done in May when the legislature sent a budget to the governor. The governor has extraordinary power under the Constitution to do reduction vetoes and line item vetoes. He could have used those to fashion this budget to his liking.
So no timetable. Could be all the way May?
I'm not offering any timetable. I'm here. I'm at work. As you know, we are in continuous session here.
I do know. Thank you, Speaker. Thank you very much. And now coming up, we'll hear from the GOP side of the argument. We'll talk with Senate Leader Christine Radogno, and she'll give the Republican response to the governor's State of the State next.
Join Matt Porter as he puts lawmakers in the hot seat.
Because last time this came up, you didn't vote for you.
And hear directly from those in power about the latest political issues.
Everybody should be working toward that effort.
Capitol Connection, Sunday mornings at 10:30 on WCIA 3.
Napleton's Toyota of Urbana, we're rolling in the new year by rolling back prices and payments. It's the New Year Rollback Sales Event. Now, all new 2016 Corollas with 0% APR for 60 months, plus 500 bonus cash. Or 2016 Camrys with 0% APR for 60 months, plus 1,000 bonus cash. Or get 2,500 cash back on a new Prius at Napleton's Toyota of Urbana. I-74 in Cunningham, Urbana.
Second to none since 1931.
One of the great things about farming is still being close to the land and really understanding what it takes to produce a crop. We want to connect with people on that.
The governor gave his second State of the State earlier this afternoon, and joining to talk about the Republican opinion of the speech is Senate Minority Leader Christine Radogno. Senate Leader Radogno, thanks for joining us here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, Republicans who I've spoken to called this an olive branch speech, a speech that was meant to open up the door to compromise. Is that what you got out of it? What'd you hear?
Well, I definitely think the tenor of the speech was very positive, forward-looking, focusing on areas that Republicans and Democrats definitely do agree on, things like criminal justice reform, education funding. So I think we're trying to outline a lot of areas we do agree on.
You know, but Democrats say there was really no mention of the budget, and if you look at it, he really specifically mentioned it once. You know, it's the biggest story of the year. It continues to be the biggest story. Should the governor maybe have talked more about how he plans to try to make some compromise?
Well, he'll definitely be talking about the budget in 2 weeks. I mean, today is the day to sort of set the agenda, the overall tone, which I think he did very, very well, kind of aspirational in the ways to make Illinois better, more competitive, make sure that we have people and job creators in the state staying here and helping the economy.
Yeah, we heard a lot about your colleague, Senate President Cullerton, in the speech about pension reform and education reform. Are those areas that you think there can be some major accomplishments this year? I mean, those are two hard issues that haven't really been changed in years. Do you think, with the support of Senate President Cullerton, that those aspirations can be achieved?
Well, I think the pension reform has already got some legs. There's been some language exchange. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to get something that at least the General Assembly agrees on. It will go to court. On the issue of education reform, there's broad agreement. We need to reform the formula. That's a very difficult, complex, and lengthy process. If we don't actually get to the reform, my hope is that along with a budget, we would have a commitment to do that.
Okay, well, it's the budget. The budget is the big story. You've been involved in the meetings as well. I asked Speaker Madigan about how have they been going. There have been 3 of them. So how have the meetings gone?
They haven't been terrifically productive. I mean, the fact of the matter is the governor's been clear that we're not just going to pass a budget that raises taxes to fund the status quo, that there has to be fundamental change in this state. And to date, with the exception of President Cullerton now agreeing to work on the pension issue, we've pretty much hit a brick wall. In terms of the Democrats being willing to actually compromise on issues of importance.
So you've hit the brick wall. You know, the Democrats sort of mapped out where you are. The Republicans mapped out where they are. How do you break through the brick wall? What's going to change in between now and March and April and hopefully not May to break that brick wall?
Well, we need the Democrat constituencies to put pressure on their leadership that they need to compromise, that the status quo isn't working for anyone, most certainly not the working people in this state. So we need their engagement to make some of these changes that will directly, some of them will directly impact the budget.
Yeah, the speaker who we just had on again would tell you that the House Democrats have voted for a property tax freeze 17 times. They voted for some version of workers' compensation. He says he's made some compromises. Why haven't those gone anywhere?
Well, for the fact of the matter is the workers' comp reform the House passed, according to the people that actually are involved in the system, made it worse. Secondly, with respect to property tax freeze, we're not out to freeze taxes for the sake of freezing taxes. The point is to freeze taxes and then give local governments the tools to be able to manage tax dollars more effectively, and that's what the Speaker's been refusing to discuss.
That gets into collective bargaining, and that's sort of a bedrock of Illinois. Unions have been here for ages. Do you think that you can get any sort of collective bargaining reforms in a state like Illinois?
There most certainly is area for compromise without gutting unions. And for anyone to say otherwise, when we look at the statistics where we see that we are out of step with the private sector. Public unions in the state are out of step with public unions in other states. That's just ridiculous. There is room for compromise and change, and that's what we're looking for.
Well, the governor talked about jobs and the economy and creating jobs, but he still talked about redistricting reform and term limits, which even if they pass, wouldn't affect anybody for a couple of years. Term limits for some lawmakers could be a while. Why keep pushing these election reforms if your job is to spur the economy? How does they?
An interesting statistic that the University of Indiana not too recently came out with is that the cost of corruption, cronyism, and so on in this state in particular is $1,300 a year per person. If you think that doesn't affect people, you're dead wrong. Everyone would love to have another $1,300 in their pocket.
Certainly not a reputation Illinois likes to broadcast.
No.
We're going to look into now the 2017 budget shortly. Do we expect an agreement to maybe include both budgets at this point?
I think that's a possibility. We're already more than halfway through the fiscal year. I think with the consent decrees and court orders and so on, we probably are going to go all the way through to May. So I think it'd be difficult to look at only one year.
So are you saying that it's likely we could be in May and still not have a 2016 budget?
I certainly think it's possible. I hope that's not the case.
I think a lot of people in Illinois hope that's not the case. Well, Leader Radogno, thank you for joining us. And now coming up,
it's time we restore balance between taxpayers and state government.
well, lawmakers weren't the only ones listening to the governor. Next, we'll talk with the Chamber of Commerce and union leaders about what they heard in the speech.
Go deep. Hand off. Crunch time. Football and Jets pizza. Now that's a winning team. Right now, get a Jets deep dish duo with premium mozzarella cheese and one topping for only $13.49. And don't forget to add a side of Jets wings. Order online and have it delivered right to your door, just in time for kickoff, the playoffs, or because you need a night off.
Life is short. Eat better pizza. Let's get Jets.
Hi, I'm Troy Lands from Lands Heating, Cooling, and Plumbing. Lands is your local Mitsubishi electric diamond dealer. Our technicians are experts at solving your comfort needs, one room or your whole house. Let us show you how a Mitsubishi electric heating and cooling system can save you money